Welcome to our first talk in the Divis room this morning. We've got Russell here, and we're talking about software engineering in the AI era, pragmatism over evangelism. Over to you.
Thank you very much. How's everyone doing this morning? Full house, it's good to see. All right, there's a lot of hype with AI, so I'm going to take a bit of a pragmatic view through that based on some of the experiences I've had using AI myself, running some of the teams, and some of the experiences that they have had in terms of how do you adopt this, what works well, what doesn't. Huge topic. In 30 minutes, we're not going to cover everything. And if we have a little bit of time at the end, I might do a little demo, but that all depends on how quickly we get through some of this stuff. But I wanted to start by thinking about how do we learn from the past. And when we look at some of the previous technological revolutions that have happened, in the Industrial Revolution, stables became garages, jobs changed, petrol stations didn't exist when there were no cars. These are all things that we find ubiquitous, but sometimes when you're in the middle of those changes happening, you're not even aware that that's going on. Let me fast forward to the internet and .com revolution, where there was a big bubble that burst and everyone hears the hype around the AI bubble bursting. The reality is there were winners, there were losers, but people couldn't predict who those winners and losers were going to be. Amazon and Netflix were not big companies. They were derided for a long time. And it wasn't until like a decade later that they became huge, huge companies. So the foundations had been laid, but the future was hard to predict. And then you put on top of that the digital revolution and mobile, the smartphone, and suddenly that becomes democratization of access to the internet. It's no longer the dial-up era. We can get on our phones, we can access stuff, and all these digital services started coming about. In fact, entire companies that couldn't exist before the smartphone became a reality. Deliveroo, Uber, etc. And I think when we talk about AI and we hear all this hype, it's easy to fall into a couple of different camps. But the reality is that change is constant. And we have a choice. We have a choice whether or not we embrace this change, whether or not we want to fight the tide, or whether or not we want to ride that wave. And I'm not going to get into the debate of what's going to last and so forth. I'm going to try and focus on some pragmatic tips to help us. And how do we manage the hype? How do we manage the thrill of riding that wave and not fall off and hurt ourselves, and ultimately succeed and go forward in a happy way? Said more eloquently than I just said it, Steve Jobs talks about innovation being that ability to see change as an opportunity, not a threat. So how do we lean into that, and how do we not be held back by fear? So I'm going to talk about some observations I've made around AI, sort of a little bit more generic initially, then going into coding assistance, and hopefully these tips are helpful from a framework perspective as to how do you move forward with this. The number one problem I see when it comes to AI is, what problem are we trying to solve? It's the answer, what was my question, right? I see some nods in the audience. I'm sure you all feel this. You need to focus on the use case. You need to really have something tangible that you're trying to improve. Yes, it allows you to solve problems that didn't exist, and that's where it gets really exciting. But always, always, always think about what core problem are you trying to solve. The next thing that happens is, what do we mean by AI? Everyone conflates the terms. There's machine learning, there's image processing, there's Gen AI, there's agentic now, and there's coding assistance. Make sure you're thinking about what is the problem so you can choose the right tool to solve that problem, and you'll get a lot further on the journey. And then finally, thinking about the Gen AI side of things, because that's the thing that's really got people excited and got people, bought into what's going on here. You can go a long way with prompt engineering, and that's a job title now that didn't exist, and I talked about some of that stuff before, but we can get really excited about RAG, and we can get really excited about creating models, but you can get a long, long way if you've used the prompts with an existing model that's very, very good at doing something rather than getting too carried away. So taking that into the coding side of things, the reality that I've seen, I'd love to hear a bit of debate and Q&A afterwards if people have different opinions on this. Greenfield applications seem to do a lot better with AI coding assistance. When it's a small context, it's able to get through things quickly. And there again, you've got a choice. Do you just say, well, it's crap at my legacy application, therefore I'm not going to use it? Or do you think differently about how you leverage some of those tools to create something new, create the right boundaries around what you've got from a technology perspective? And I think that's a really fundamental question to ask yourself. When are you going to fight with the tool to try and do something it's not capable of yet? Or are you going to use it for what it's good at and move forward? Code is a liability. That's sometimes a bit of a divide the room moment, but the reality is that the more code you have to maintain it, you have to support it, it can have bugs in it, it can be problematic. It's now more disposable than ever. It's so easy to generate reams of code, and embracing that ability to dispose of it, get rid of it, and improve it is a mindset. Matty Wilson on LinkedIn recently from Instill posted something about premature optimization and how people are like using Gen AI to create lots of code, and then they're trying to create these frameworks and platforms and really over-engineer it. Yagni means you ain't going to need it. It's like premature optimization means that you're not going to need that. When you're talking about what code that you're generating, how do you choose what code and what level of quality before you learn and discard and create something new? Next point is really quite a simple one. We've seen great success ramping up new team members whenever you put your code into GitHub and you index it. So instead of the junior developer, relatively speaking, they could be a senior, but they're new to the code base, is getting up to speed. Instead of tapping the senior on the shoulder and constantly distracting them and making them unproductive, they can spend time querying the code base, getting documentation, asking questions to understand it better. And then when there's something that doesn't make sense, then they can go and talk to the senior. Now, that doesn't always work. We have had repos that have been challenged with this. And indeed, if a person doesn't understand the design patterns and paradigms that you're using in the repo, it's not really going to help them with that. Good example is if it's a domain-driven design or CQRS pattern, if the developer doesn't know that, they kind of need to know the fundamentals first before that can be helpful. And then last point on this slide is around understanding the models and where they have strengths and weaknesses. GPT-4o, for example, very good for real-time assistance and feedback. However, Claude and Sonnet, much better for agentic flows where it can go deep reasoning, thinking, and higher code quality are the focus of those models. So depending on what type of problem you're trying to solve, you might want to use a different model in order to solve that. And by understanding the strengths, the limitations, and the cutoff dates, because then they're not going to know what repos exist, etc., then you're going to put yourself in a much better place. So those are things I would encourage any developers in the room to embrace, and any leaders to encourage your developers to do. I want to get a little bit controversial here for a second before going to the next set of observations. Quote from CEO of AWS. Maybe. It's an opinion. It's definitely not a fact at this point in time. But if I think about where we've got to in terms of high-level languages, object-oriented programming, and why they came to bear, they were created because machine code was hard and difficult and slow to progress with. Natural language is the ultimate goal. Are we there yet? No. When will we be there? I have absolutely no idea. But it is plausible that we will get to a point in time where developers won't be coding, but what will they be doing? I think it's still important that they understand the technologies, they understand the architectural patterns, they understand what good and bad looks like, so that they can make sure that they're curating and managing the code. But this is a fundamental paradigm shift, because a lot of people just want to keep doing what they're doing, and the world might move around beyond them. And that's forced me to challenge my mindset. I've actually went back and thought about some of the things that used to be considered anti-patterns when Agile came about. Agile was about delivering value, etc., quickly. And it came about through frustration of how quickly you could deliver value to customers. And the principles are still true. But the reality is there's this whole set of ceremonies and processes and methods and tools that we've built around those principles that were important at a point in time, but now probably need to evolve as we move forward. So business requirements documents, PRDs, technical design docs, these are all now much easier to generate with generative AI. You can create templates that allow you then to make sure you have all the elements that you want to make sure are included, including your non-functional requirements, your architecture, your technology choices, tests and test coverage and stuff like that. And flip side is because they're easier to generate, the LLMs can understand the text and can work a lot well with that. So I think there's a lot in the spec-driven development space we're going to see a lot more happening with that. That is definitely a bit more of a forward-thinking view. I think we've seen some success. Where it goes and what the SDLC looks like, questions to be answered there, but I can see that getting a lot more condensed, a lot quicker and easier for product, for example, to prototype things in Vercel or Bolt or whatever, or Lovable rather, and then get to the understanding of what is it that you're trying to build quicker, create documentation of that can be then used for developers to then move that forward. And I'll give a couple of examples of some. Well, actually, that leads me on to an example about giving space for innovation and the pleasant surprise around that. I saw Peter McCullough earlier. I'm not sure if he's still in the room. I'm going to call him out on two things that he did that really excited me. One was hooking Jira up via MCP to Cursor so that he could query within his IDE what was going on in the ticket. So you're talking about shortening that cycle of interaction. There's no context switching in that. You can ask a question, you can get clarification, etc. That to me is exciting. Another one was using browser tools to hook it up with the MCP to Cursor. So instead of going into your web console, log, copy, paste, search, find, resolve, and go through that cycle, able to do that from within Cursor directly, and the cycle time changes and dramatically comes down. I will always say that human needs to be in the loop. Developers need to read and understand that code. You'll see a little bit more of that coming later. Don't just trust blindly what it's doing, but it's exciting how much quicker sometimes this stuff can come. The guidance piece is important. You can't simply let everyone go off and play Wild West. People will get lost, people won't know what they're doing, and you won't actually be able to deliver value. At the end of the day, our job is to deliver value to our customers. So you need to make sure that there's some guide rails around that innovation, whether that's one Friday a sprint, it's a set aside amount of time, whatever it happens to be, make sure there's some guardrails around that. One thing we noticed was the change tax. So whenever we were getting people to do these experimentations, and we would just say, this team would go through and spend a day going through different experiments that they wanted to run, see which worked quicker and which didn't. And to be honest, a lot of things weren't quicker, and that was good. That was a good finding because it allowed us to refine what we should be doing. But it's a lot easier to swap a model within your IDE than it is to say suddenly shift the entire company from Cursor to Windsurf or then back again to Visual Studio, because you've realized that it's jumping ahead in the benches, the SWE bench and stuff like that. So it's tempting to redeploy. If you're a very large company, you've got large engineering teams, be mindful of that. Focus on swapping the models, and you'll still get a lot of learning. And one thing we weren't great at, but we saw the need for this, and we started getting better at it, is just because you've learned something doesn't mean it's valuable. If it's in an echo chamber, it's isolated. You need to make sure that there's a way in which the teams can share those learnings with other people so that they can move forward and embrace that. And that's why it's important to celebrate and share the success. The temptation with generative AI and AI coding assistance is that it's about running quicker, getting more done, and so forth. And we've all heard it before, slow down to speed up, and speed with control. That's one where it's really important to make sure you've got that speed with control so that you're not just keep doing things and experimenting, but that you're sharing and learning and taking a minute to breathe and understand that. And that leaves us in that position of what is real and what is not when the AI music stops. And as I said at the start, it's really hard to predict exactly what that's going to look like. But if this is what's true today, how do we anchor on that, and how do we keep going around that cycle of what is true today, what is true today, what is true today, and how do we continuously learn? And I'll look back at that a little bit towards the end. So AI coding assistance, it's amazing. It creates so much code. Isn't that wonderful? We're problem solved. Far from it. One of the things I hear a lot from senior developers in particular is when junior developers start using these tools and they don't necessarily know what good looks like. And that's really the job that we have as leaders, is to make sure that we are helping junior developers to become more senior as quickly as possible. So I've put up here some simple heuristics that make it easy to follow. And it's a really quite high level, but the point of this is to try and address that challenge of writing too much code is not necessarily a good thing. So some of the things I found work well, the temptation to one-shot it, and then you end up with so much stuff that you can't understand it, and you have to go back and unpick it. Breaking it down as you would when you're solving normal tasks is a good way to do it. Obviously, you should understand what the code is doing. Like, plain and simple, that's table stakes. Again, if it's generated a lot of code, well, here's a bit of a hack. Paul Breen actually was one of the people who put me onto this one, and that was the ability to ask the assistant what the code is doing, so you can double check as well as looking at it yourself. So you get a bit of triangulation. It's not just about you, it's not just about what was generated, but you're checking those things. And thirdly, related to that is, well, ask it to generate test cases, and this can be really interesting because sometimes it'll generate code, then it'll generate test cases, and one of the test cases proves the code doesn't work. So that's a really simple hack to solve that problem. And then the other stuff is actually the harder piece. And I don't know if I've got a great answer to this question yet, but it is something I'm wrestling with. How to understand what good looks like. Code smells, how many lines of code were generated, does it look right, does it sound right, does it smell right? If there's a sleep 5000 in there, why the hell is it in there? And that's a real example where we've seen people accept that code and then a senior developer go, hang on a minute, why is that doing that? And that comes back to a paraphrase that is AI generated, not actually said by Martin Fowler, but does follow the philosophy of what he's talking about of outcome over output. It's not just about shipping more code, it's shipping what matters. And how do you know that by embracing these tools that teams are getting better? And that's why you want to measure for success. And the simple starting point of that is, are people using the tools? And if not, why not? The whole point of every measure here is not to bang people over the head with it. It's to understand what's going on so that you can inquire and ask questions. So monthly active users, daily active users, great metrics for understanding with, if you've rolled it out to everyone, are they actually using it? Is it being adopted? It's hard to argue with Dora. Change frequency, deployment frequency, change failure rates, mean time to resolve, and cycle time, great metrics to measure in terms of delivering value to the customer. That's absolutely perfect if you're able to be in CI/CD and you're deploying multiple times a day. But most companies, most teams I've found is there's a sliding scale with that, and there's sometimes delivery within a sprint, and that then becomes a lagging indicator, and it's hard to know what's really going on. And then you can look at velocity or throughput to understand, but those are really easy to game. And that comes back to my point that if you just measure stuff without that philosophy of this is to inspect, to improve, and the teams don't believe in that and they feel it's like some top-talking directive to beat you up on, then you're not going to get the outcome that you're seeking there. And I think the thing I kind of want to underscore at the bottom there is that you need to measure and against a controller baseline. So if you don't even have a baseline to measure from, how do you know that you're measuring for improvement? I've talked about some quantitative measures there. There's also qualitative. So if you're not familiar with these, Microsoft have released a space framework. There's DevX, or DX is Core 4. This is about developer experience. What does it feel like to use these two tools? Do you feel more productive? It's a little bit more fluffy, but it's an important part of this, because if people feel like this is something that they want to get involved in, then you're missing an important part of this. And actually, there's a lot more tools that are helping to do this, to measure the productivity gains that you're actually getting through the AI adoption. So those are worth exploring. Simply accepting code is not a really good measure. Like, you can accept crappy code. Code displacement, stuff that stays there over the long term, is a better measure for that. And the reality is that measures are imperfect. So it comes back to, if you don't measure it, you don't know it's improving, and you need buy-in in order to measure it. So the question is, where do we go from here? And really, there's a couple of things I wanted to share. And one is, what is everything I've covered distilled? 5-step framework if you want to deploy AI coding assistance. Get it out there, get people using it. If you don't have that already, you should. The cost benefit for it is definitely worthwhile. Even if it saves an hour a week on one person, it sort of pays for itself, sort of thing, depending on what level you go at. So get it rolled out. Make sure you're measuring who's using it. Then measure the gains. Then make sure you're evaluating emerging tools. What works well today will not work well tomorrow. The models keep fighting each other. New IDEs come out. New ways of doing things come out. Keep evaluating that. That doesn't mean every team suddenly shifts. It means that you are very controlled about your experiments. You have feedback from those experiments to decide, actually, now we're going to start using this, or we're going to learn and share so that people use something else. And then that leads into the last piece, the cross-team continuous learning. I can't get over how exciting it is when people go off and do something innovative, and then it really works, and engineers are excited about it, and they share it with another engineer, and it starts to really improve things. And that's the culture that you want in terms of displacing and adopting this. So summarizing all that, embrace it, experiment. And what I would love to do is, as a community, can we start discussing that, challenge it, grow, and share those learnings across different companies and so forth? I think that'd be really, really helpful. And in fact, that's one of the things I'm going to try and jump into in a minute. And I did say this at the start. I'm alluding to this. The software delivery lifecycle is changing. I don't know what it's going to look like, but we're in the midst of that. So thinking about what works today and why it is the way it is today versus what it could be, because we now have new tools, is something we should always be thinking about, so that we keep moving forward and keep evolving. So I've got a few minutes here. I'm going to risk a demo here live. It wasn't working amazingly well for me in earlier, OpenAI. Has anyone seen the OpenAI Dev Day talk, by the way? Show of hands. Oh, wow, not one. Oh, I encourage absolutely everyone to do that. Right, this is the unrehearsed bit. Let's see where we end up. So there was actually a very good, here we go, problem number 1. Yay, it wasn't that hard. No, this will be the hard part because I'm looking up here and trying to do this. So this is using something called ChatKit from OpenAI and the agent builder. Let me see, I need to move that desktop as well. I'll leave cursor where it is. Right, so this is ChatKit. It's hooked up to Agent Builder. So what can you do? Simply click on that, and it will go off to OpenAI. It'll come back with, what can this agent that I've already created do? So I've created one that is trying to solve the challenge that I've just talked about there. So, I'm just going to type in a little bit about myself. I'm Russell. And it's always awful trying to do demo talking. So let's see how it goes with that. And this is going pretty slow, but while that's doing that, I might flip over to talk about what is the agent. So it's a super simple agent. It's the AI gripes and grins agent. And all this is a visual way of seeing this. So it's a prompt asking 3 different questions. Who are you? What do you like about AI? What do you dislike? And then whenever you've got it, it moves on to the next step in that. And you'll see the JSON at the bottom being built up over time as I sort of talk about it. So it's worked out who I am. Tell me a little bit about myself. I'm a speaker at NIDC. I love cursor. Thank you for the autocorrect help. All right, while it's doing that, I'll move on to the next agent in the process, which is a mapping agent. And for anyone that's familiar with agentic coding, it's all about the prompts, it's all about tools, it's all about how do you search against certain things, and the agent kind of works out where to go. But I want a bit more structured so that I can send this to a Google Sheets later, so I can review all the output that's in there, and I can put in a response schema so that I want to make sure that I capture, who is the person, what's most valuable, biggest frustration, favorite coding assistant, and so forth. So that mapping agent basically takes the structure of the conversation and allows me then to map to that JSON so that it can be posted to any web service that you might want to have in there afterwards. What's the single most valuable thing? Speed, which OpenAI is struggling with at the minute because I'm doing a demo. It always feels more awkwardly slower whenever we're watching those dots go by. And I've run out of things to show in between. So flip side is, what's the biggest frustration? Well, let's stick slowness and flakiness, right? It's non-deterministic, and that can lead to some wacky things happening potentially. So it's done the mapping, it's pulled in the speed part as being most valuable, and it's Oh, I did something wrong, did I? Oh, I haven't pressed enter. So, yes, thank you. And there it is. There's the JSON at the end, and that can then be posted and sent on to stuff. Now, I threw this together last night, an hour while waiting in the lounge for a flight. This is how easy and it is to pull together some of these things. Obviously, a fully fledged system would pull this together and actually post that somewhere. I didn't quite get that far before I had to board. But what's interesting about this is you're now seeing a different way of programming. If you're in the agentic space, you're no longer using the SDKs. You've got visual indicators and stuff like this. And the interesting thing for me about the OpenAI Dev Day was that it was a dev day that I didn't see one line of code written at. So I encourage everyone to watch that and see what you think about that. But I might pause there. We've come up to the sort of 30-minute mark. And now ready for Q&A if anyone has anything. Oh, there's a lot.
Thanks a million for the talk. Really, really interesting. I want to rewind to something that you kind of gave as a throwaway line almost back at the very start, and it was that idea of the spec and the natural language and, do we need to code as well? If you fast forward maybe 2 or 3 years, do you have any idea to what that might look like? I mean, it's not going to be the business users coding, but they might have more input to the process. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that point about it not being the business users that code being a really important one. I think we've been here before with technology in some respects where I remember wizards and UIs like this where in theory business people are able to do things really easily. And in fact, I know pretty technical business people that still struggle with this because it's not just about the fact that there's a tool that looks easy to use. It's about logic and how it ties together. And there's still something about the mindset around what are the sequence of steps. And I think one of the hardest things for us to deal with in this new world is where does non-deterministic code meet deterministic code, and how do you have high degrees of predictability around that? So even though these tools may be more business-centric, I don't think they take away from how do you make sure that you're testing them, evaluating them, and you have the right people. What I do think it means is you'll be bringing together a different shaped team, and that product people will move closer to the code, but not quite there. You'll need some more data scientists for the evals of the models and make sure that they're going well, and engineers to sort of do the logic side of things. I don't think that's going away. I just think it's going to speed things up. That's my own opinion on it, though.
Who else had their hand up there?
Hello. You talked about measuring adoption. One of the things we're struggling with is actually motivating people to adopt this. I think as an industry, we're still very skeptical about what it can do for us, and I don't think we've got to an acceptance yet. So what are your thoughts? What can we do as an industry to drive up adoption and acceptance of this tool?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. This is the fundamental problem, and that's exactly why I said change is constant. It's an opportunity or a threat, depending on your perspective on it. And look, I'm a cynical developer myself, right? So I know that when I use these tools, sometimes it doesn't do what I want it to do, and that can be frustrating. But I think what's important about it is, I don't know what to do about it industry-wide. That's why I'm here, because I'm trying to talk to the industry to do my part in that. But our responsibility as leaders or engineers is to focus on those change champions, the people that are really excited about it and can get it to work, and then use that as the catalyst to move the change on. In any change curve, I don't know if you come across, it's like a Kubler-Ross curve, right? You have the early adopters, the really excitable people, the early adopters, then the fence sitters, the late adopters, and the laggards who will go kicking and screaming over my dead body. As you move, you double down on the early adopters, spend your energy there. That then spreads, and then the vacuum will bring people along the way. It's a typical change journey. Creating a sense of urgency around the change as well helps, but being pragmatic about that instead of like completely fear-driven.
Unfortunately, we don't have time because we're running late for another question. But I'm sure if you have any more questions, Russell will be happy to ask. But. Cool. Or answer. But thank you very much, Russell.
Thanks, everyone.